You're listening to episode 309 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Toni Bernhard joins us to speak about the updated and revised edition of her book, How to Be Sick, a Buddhist-inspired guide for the chronically ill and their caregivers. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find that this episode or other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. One of the difficulties I have when teaching loving kindness or doing the practice myself through traditional recitations is about being well or being healthy. That aspiration, even when it's about cultivating a mind state, falls flat because it's so very alien to my actual lived experience. Many of us have daily pain and chronic illness, so "may I be well" can elicit not just a little cognitive dissonance, but can even be emotionally traumatic. That doesn't mean metta is bad or that Buddhism isn't for us, but that there may be different ways folks who are suffering in this way can meet the Dhamma. Toni Bernhard has been a long-time meditator, going on long meditation retreats and spending many hours rigorously practicing, but soon discovered she could simply no longer engage in those difficult and taxing forms. She's had to learn ways to make being sick the heart of her spiritual practice, and through truly learning how to be sick, she learned how, even with many physical and energetic limitations, to live a life of equanimity, compassion, and joy. So sit back, relax, and have a nice lemon zinger tea. Our guest today, returning to the podcast, I think for a third time, is our friend Toni Bernhard. Toni, welcome back. Nice to see you again.
It's great to be here again. Thank you.
So you've been with us a few times, and for those who are listening, I'll just give you a heads up that I'll be linking to the previous episodes where Toni was a guest on the podcast. And really the first one might be one you want to go back and listen to before going forward, and that was on episode 54, and that was on Toni's book, How to Be Sick, and that was from 2011. We're now in 2019, so it was a little while ago, and there has been a revised and updated edition of the book. So today we're just going to have a check-in on that. Toni, what is it that made you decide to do a revised edition?
Well, I have to admit it was not my idea. My publisher asked if I would do it. And my first thought was no, because it's a lot of work. I feel as if it was another half book at least. And my health is not great. It was a lot of work. And so I first thought no. And then I got out the first book, which was published in 2012. So that's why we talked 2011. And I just saw a lot that I would like to change, either refining and updating some of the practices. And then there were, maybe a dozen new ones I wanted to put in there. There were some things that were out of date. I had a little reference to in the section about the metta section, where you pick a difficult person and work on sending metta to them. I had used Sarah Palin as an example. Well, so that was one of the main, that was the principal reason, that I saw how I could make what was there better, either by revising it or taking it out, and I could add new practices. And I also, I get a lot of emails from people who read my books, and I get a lot from people who are suffering from mental illness, and often PTSD or depression, and they say how much the book had helped them. But it was not written with that in mind. It was written with physical illness in mind. And I wanted to include mental illness. Now, I have to be careful there because I'm not a therapist. And so there's only so far that I feel is appropriate for me to go. But I wanted to incorporate those with mental illness into the book. And I wanted to write more about caregivers because it's in the subtitle. And I also wanted to, oddly enough, delete all of the Buddhist terms that I could delete, because I thought when I wrote the first edition that this was a book that mostly Buddhists would be interested in. I'd been practicing then for maybe 15 years, And so I used all of the Pali terms and some Sanskrit terms, and then people would write to me and say, what was that word for compassion again? And it seems as if, particularly in the secular Buddhist world, that when we don't need to use a Pali or a Sanskrit term, we just don't. And so there are a few that I use, like dukkha, because I don't feel that there's one word that really describes it. But for the most part, I took out the Buddhist terms because most of my readers aren't Buddhist. Yeah. So that was another factor. And I think that pretty much covers why I did this.
Yeah. It sounds like, as you're describing this, that a large influence of it is the accessibility of the work, and that after you first published it, a few things came up, like people who are suffering from mental illness or PTSD or other challenges like that is another kind of being sick. So you're broadening accessibility to them. That wasn't the initial intent, but you became open and including of that, as well as things like, it's more than Buddhists. And that's a pleasant surprise that actually speaks to how the book itself touches people, because it's based on their human experience. It's not one that requires that you have a particular ideological stance. It just requires that you have human experience with not being.
I don't practice Buddhism as a religion. Now, what is a religion? This is a debate that's been going on in the Buddhist community, because some people say that religions carry with them the idea of a deity or a god, but the Buddha was just a human being. And I think there have been some traditions that when Buddhism reached certain countries, the Buddha was elevated to a position of godliness. And but for me, it's a practical and sometimes and spiritual, but it's not a religious path. It's a practical path, and that's why. He just was the most insightful human being I've run into in my life, and so I'm constantly learning from his teachings, and so although I did omit a lot of the Buddhist terms, that subtitle that says a Buddhist-inspired guide, it's still Buddhist-inspired because I've just, that's the path I follow in life, even though a lot of it overlaps with other religions. I mean, Buddhism does not have isn't the only place one can learn about compassion and
or even mindfulness, as I often push back on those who insist that secular mindfulness programs are doing it wrong because we're not doing it our way, which is the true way. And well, let's pause for a moment there.
Yeah.
How to define mindfulness? What do you mean by that? Is it exclusively a Buddhist thing, or is it a human capability? It kind of depends on what we mean by it.
Yeah, definitely. And, I guess when I get asked about that, I say that as far as I know, I'm not a Buddhist scholar. I'm not a scholar of religion or spiritual traditions, but I think it originated with the Buddha, but not as a religious practice, but as a practical one. And so I like the way you characterized it as something as a human potential for living with more peace and equanimity and wisdom, really. Because for me, mindfulness, there's lots of things to be mindful of, and there's this tendency to say that what you see and what you hear. And for me, the true value of mindfulness is I find out what's going on in my mind.
Right. What direction is that alertness going? Is it an external stuff? Is it internal? A blend?
Right.
There's so many ways to be present.
Yes. And just that being able to say, oh, I'm telling myself that scary story again. Well, that's all it is. It's just thoughts arising and passing, and recognizing it for that and not clinging to it. It's just so valuable. So there's a lot about mindfulness in the book.
Now, you mentioned that you'd added in some new practices too. And before we started recording, you had mentioned one that your husband, Toni, had been using.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you might mention just a few of the new things that are in the book, the new practices that stand out to you, or some of your favorites.
Well, I guess the most important one for people, and I actually think this would apply to anyone, even if they're healthy, but I included in this one, in the new version, a whole section on pacing. And partly because I'm not very good at it, but as I say in the book, I've been ill now for almost 18 years, and the pacing is the best treatment I've found yet. And when I look at my friends who are healthy, they could use some pacing skills too. So I have maybe 4 or 5 different ways for people to learn to pace themselves, particularly if they're ill. And so one, for example, is you think about, well, these are all the things I'm going to do today, and then you cut it in half. You do 50% of that. And so some very practical pacing ideas. And then this practice that I got from my husband, he's a Buddhist chaplain at Folsom Prison, which is about 50 minutes from us. And he teaches mindfulness there. And he has this practice he taught the inmates called 3-breath practice. He actually calls it the 3-breath trip, because that's the way he talks. But in the book, I call it 3-breath practice, giving him credit for it, where at random intervals during the day, you stop whatever you're doing and just take 3, an in-breath and an out-breath, an in-out breath, and do that 3 times. And it's amazing the effect that it has. It slows you down. It reveals what kind of reactivity is going on in your mind that might not be fruitful or wise. And it also helps you pause before you might do something unskillful. And so that's another practice in the book that is a favorite. And I have one other, which in the first edition, I talk about having gone to Spirit Rock, which is in Marin County here. I'm sure a lot of the listeners have heard of Spirit Rock.
Yeah.
And my Toni and I, my husband's name is also Toni, we used to go there a lot, but once a year, Achan Jumnian, who was a Thai monk, would come to Spirit Rock and teach. And he didn't speak English, so Jack Cornfield would translate for him. And he had this wonderful practice that I call It's Okay, basically, where he didn't introduce it as a practice. He just was chatting away up and at the front of the hall and saying things like, if people give me something to eat, that's okay. If they don't, that's okay. I need to lose weight. If it's too cold to go if I can go for a walk, that's okay. If it's too cold, that's okay. I'll take a little nap. And so I turned that into I had that practice in the old book, but I added to it in the new, a practice that I've been pursuing called It's Okay If. And then I challenge myself in a way. And of course, the big one for me is it's okay if I'm chronically ill the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. And that has been a very fruitful challenge for me to contemplate, because I can spend a lot of my day, if I'm having a particularly difficult day with the illness, where nothing's okay. And then I will say, it's okay if I'm chronically ill the rest of my life. And, it is okay, because this is just my life. I can't will myself not to be sick. So I found this to be very helpful to, if I'm feeling if I'm in a lot of pain one day, for example, to say, it's okay if I'm in pain. And the reason it's so helpful is that if you're in pain, you're in pain. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do what you can to alleviate this physical pain I'm talking about here, whether it be taking a medication or a warm bath or meditating. I'm not saying that this is not a passive practice, but this is one that recognizes that life has its difficulties. And I can't expect to be pain-free all the time. I have a medical condition that includes pain. And so saying to myself, it's okay if I'm in pain, for me is a form of self-compassion. It softens your thinking about it.
It sounds like you're putting a little intention around not stabbing yourself with a second arrow.
Absolutely, right. Because pain is that first arrow. And then, as Toni, my husband, likes to say, then we make things worse by adding all the mental stories around it. I'll always be in pain. I can't be, there's no equanimity in pain. Where there is equanimity in pain. It's not always easy to find, but the more you accept what's come your way this very day, the closer you get to an equanimous state of mind, which for me is, well, I like to say that's as close to enlightenment as I think I'll get, and that's fine with me. If I could be equanimous all day long, I would take it. So a lot of my practices are to kind of nudge us in that direction of being okay with our present moment experience. Because it's really, there's a wonderful line, this isn't in the book, but I love the writings of Joko Beck, who's a Zen teacher, and several of her, I have several quotes from her in the book, but I was just rereading Everyday Zen, which is one of my favorite books, even though Zen is not my particular tradition. And she says, the only thing we can rely on in life, and then she repeats it, the only thing is that the present moment will be as it is. The only thing. And so a lot of the practices in the book are different doorways into accepting your life as it is, because for me, that's the path to peace and equanimity.
Right. I think that's an interesting point and a good one to make for the listeners if they have not heard the previous episode. This isn't really about getting rid of the illness. The illness is going to be here. This really does, with your own experiences, of course, mine and that of many listeners, is with chronic illness of some kind. And it's, how do we meet that?
Yes.
And not make things, as your husband says, how do we not make things worse? Because that's how conditions are right now, in the same way that, gravity is. I'm okay with gravity. We typically don't need to do that because it's part of we're used to it. And yet there's also this other thing, and it may be illness, and we're not used to that. And there's a struggle against that, as we might have struggled against gravity when we were little. And there needs to be an adjustment of, how am I going to meet gravity? How am I going to meet conditions as they are?
I love your example of gravity. One thing that there are 2 chapters in the book that I actually rewrote in line with my current understanding. And one of them was the chapter, you could say, it's mostly on the first noble truth, but the second is in there too. It's hard to separate them. And there is a part of in that first noble truth, the Buddha has what I call the Buddha's list, and I give it a subtitle, the Buddha's list, in which he talks about experiences that, and it will be familiar to a lot of people listening, experiences that we all will come upon at some time during our lives, because they're just part of the conditions of being alive. Birth, aging, getting what you want, not getting what you want, getting what you don't want, losing what you cherish. One of the things on that list is illness. And the reason I emphasize that in that chapter is that in this culture, at least, I can't speak for other parts of the world, but we think of illness as unnatural. But there it is, right in the Buddha's list of all the natural experiences, natural in the sense that they come with the human condition. And illness is on that list. And so that's why, like gravity, it's there. And the question is, how are we going to meet it?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Toni, is there anything else you want to share with the listeners about the new edition?
No, except, well, I guess the only thing I would say is that, as with all my books, it's always helpful to me to write them, because it forces me to, I always, when I introduce a practice, I always look for some anecdote, and generally from my own life, to illustrate how to use it. My books are not memoirs, but I'm in them because I want to be sure people understand how to bring a practice right down to earth and use it. And so being forced to do that is always very helpful to me. So I appreciate the reception that the first edition got that allowed me to write the second edition. Yeah.
Right. Well, for those who are listening, I'll have links to more than just this book. There are other books as well of Toni's that will be available through the episode page. Toni, thank you so much for being here. Really good to see you.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.